Lesson 41, Peace, Prosperity, and Progress. Peace, Prosperity, and Progress. DJ Waldy grew up in the 1950s, Lakewood, California, a community located 15 miles south of Los Angeles. In 1949, Lakewood consisted of 3,500 acres of lima bean fields. 1 year later, houses were built on the farm fields at a rate of 50 homes a day. By 1953, some 90,000 people lived in Lakewood, making it the fastest growing housing development in the world. The Depression and World War II significantly slowed home construction. At the end of the war, Lakewood developers considered the millions of soldiers returning home to marry and start a family, betting that they would soon look for a place to live. Waldy later wrote, "No theorist or urban planner had the experience then to gauge how 30,000 former GIs and their wives would take to frame and stucco houses on small rectangular lots next to hog farms and dairies. Local business people who predicted that Lakewood would be an instant slum or worse, a ghost town, could not have been more wrong. Buyers did not require encouragement," recalled Waldy. When the sales office opened on a cloudless Palm Sunday in April 1950, 25,000 people were waiting. Salesmen sold 30 to 50 houses a day and more than 300 during one weekend when the first unit of the subdivision opened. At one point, salesmen sold 107 houses an hour. For these white middle-class home buyers, owning a house in Lakewood was a symbol of their new affluence or prosperity. Aided by the GI Bill of Rights, veterans could purchase a home with no money down, only needing to provide evidence of a steady job and a promise to make house payments. A Lakewood salesperson remarked of his work, "We sell happiness in homes." Post-war politics, readjustments, and challenges. Post-war politics, readjustments, and Harry Truman never wanted to be president. The day after he learned of Franklin Roosevelt's death, he told reporters, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon and stars and all the planets had fallen on me." Truman's first task was to end the war. Once that was completed, he faced an enormous challenge of transitioning the country to a peacetime economy. A rocky transition to peace. Truman welcomed the war's end by announcing a reform package later named the Fair Deal. He called on Congress to raise the minimum wage, increase aid to agriculture and education, and enact a national health insurance program. Complaining that Truman was out New Dealing the New Deal, congressional Republicans worked to stall his reforms. At the same time, the economy was affected by a different adjustment period. Government officials canceled billions of dollars worth of war contracts when the war ended, resulting in millions of defense workers losing their jobs. And once wartime price controls were lifted, goods prices skyrocketed. Workers demanded wage increases as inflation soared, and employers refused to meet these demands. Labor unions triggered the largest strike wave in U.S. history. In 1946, nearly 5 million workers walked off the job in many key industries like steel production, coal mining, and oil refining. Truman took action when railroad workers went on strike, warning Congress. Food, raw materials, fuel, shipping, housing, public health, the public safety, all will be dangerously affected if the strike continued. Truman threatened to send the armed forces to operate the railroads, but the strike was settled before they could carry out his threat. Truman battles a Republican Congress. Labor unrest was fresh in voters' minds as the 1946 congressional election drew near. Under the slogan, "Had enough," Republican candidates swept to victory, gaining control of both congressional houses for the first time since the 1920s. One of the Republican Congress's first action was to pass the 22nd Amendment in 1947, which limited the president to 2 terms of office. The amendment's Republican sponsors did not want another liberal president like Franklin Roosevelt to seek 4 terms, arguing that without term limits, a popular president might aim to become president for life, like a dictator. The amendment was overwhelmingly ratified by the states and was added to the Constitution in 1951. In 1947, Congress also targeted labor unions by passing the Taft-Hartley Act, which established many limits on unions' power. For example, the law banned closed shop or workplaces in which employers agreed only to hire members of a certain union. 1947, Congress also passed the targeted labor unions by passing the Taft-Hartley Act, which established many limits on unions' power. For example, the law banned closed shop or workplaces in which employers agreed only to hire members of a certain union. The law also prohibited sympathy strikes, in which workers of one union would walk off their job to show solidarity with another striking union. In a provision that enraged union supporters, the law also gave the president the right to impose an 80-day cooling-off period before a union in a certain industry could strike again. With union supporters calling the Taft-Hartley Act a slave labor law, President Truman issued a veto in which Congress then overturned. Truman also battled Congress over civil rights. Late in 1946, he established the President's Committee on Civil Rights to investigate racial inequality in the United States. The committee issued a report calling for an end to segregation and discrimination in voting, housing, education, employment, and the military. Truman praised the report as an American Charter of Human Freedom. However, Congress refused to act on the recommendations, so in 1948, Truman sidestepped Congress to desegregate the armed forces by executive order. An upset victory in 1948. As the election of 1948 neared, Democrats were filled with dread. Truman had been unable to pass any of his reforms through the Republican Congress. Looked like a weak candidate. Worse yet, the Democratic Party had splintered into three factions. Left-wing Democrats, led by former U.S. Vice President Henry Wallace, separated to form the Progressive Party. Wallace was more liberal than Truman on domestic issues, but the two mainly differed on foreign policy. Fearing that Truman's strict containment policy could lead to World War III, Wallace advocated friendlier relations with the Soviet Union. Segregationist Southern Democrats, known as Dixiecrats, formed the States' Rights Democratic Party. The Dixiecrats nominated Strom Thurmond, the governor from South Carolina, for president, who ran on a platform of complete racial segregation. The Republicans nominated New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey to run against Truman. Dewey was heavily favored to win despite his lackluster campaign style. One newspaper ran this parody of the typical bland Dewey speech. "Agriculture is important. Our rivers are full of fish. You cannot have freedom without liberty. Our future lies ahead." Truman decided to fight for the presidency, launching an ambitious nationwide whistle-stop tour. Whistle-stops are small towns where the trains stop only if signaled to do so by a whistle. At each of the 365 stops on his tour, Truman spoke directly to voters and criticized the Do Nothing Republic Congress. His supporters cheered him on with the slogan, "Give him hell, Harry." Opinion polls predicted a Dewey landslide at the end of the election, and only Truman seemed to believe he could win. However, the voters proved Truman right in one of the biggest electoral upsets in history. Truman narrowly secured re-election. For the next 4 years, Truman routinely introduced fair deal programs to Congress, but his coalition of conservative Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans blocked most of the reform efforts. Yet Congress did agree to modestly expand Social Security benefits, as well as to increase the minimum wage and support slum eradication. Ike takes the middle of the road. During the 1952 election campaign, the Democratic Party rallied behind Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois. Stevenson was admired for his eloquence and wit. Meanwhile, the Republicans nominated the immensely popular war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had an impressive biography. After serving as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, Eisenhower became head of NATO. Moreover, people loved Eisenhower's winning smile and agreeable manner. Campaign posters and buttons featuring his nickname proclaimed, "I like Ike." A young senator from California named Richard Nixon was selected as Eisenhower's running mate. A strong anti-communist, Nixon gained prominence as a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee. At the polls, Eisenhower swept to victory in 39 out of 48. Eisenhower swept to victory in 39 of the 48 states, and 4 years later he defeated Stevenson once again, winning a second presidential term. During his presidency, Eisenhower embraced a policy he called modern republicanism, promising to be conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings. He resisted conservative demands to roll back the New Deal programs. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, he warned, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. Eisenhower expanded Social Security, instead ensuring that the popular New Deal program would survive no matter which party controlled the White House. Eisenhower instituted a massive peacetime arms buildup as well, claiming our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action. He did worry about the growing power of what he called the military-industrial complex, however, and warned in his last presidential address, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and large arms industry is new in the American experience. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or our democratic processes. Dwight Eisenhower, Farewell Address, 1961. Economic growth creates an age of affluence. Economic growth creates an age of affluence. In 1940, brothers Dick and Mac McDonald opened a drive-through restaurant in San Bernardino, California. The restaurant was popular, but customers sometimes had to wait up to 20 minutes for their food. Dick McDonald later recalled, the cars were jamming up in the lot. Customers weren't demanding it, but our intuition told us they would like speed. Everything was moving faster. The supermarkets, dime stores already converted to self-service, and it was obvious the future of drive-ins was self-service. Dick McDonald. Thus, McDonald's decided to streamline every aspect of business. Instead of offering hamburgers, hot dogs, and sandwiches, they shortened the menu to only hamburgers. They replaced car hops with self-service order counters and served food with paper wrappers and cups instead of plates and glasses that needed washing. In essence, they organized their kitchen to operate like an assembly line. Their timing was opportune. They reopened their restaurant as McDonald's Famous Hamburgers in 1948, when the United States was entering one of the greatest economic booms in history. By the end of the 1950s, middle-class families were enjoying a level of affluence beyond their Depression-era parents' and grandparents' imaginations. Consumer demand spurs economic growth. Americans had saved billions of dollars during World War II. Flush with cash, after the war, they were ready to commence a spending spree as soon as the factories converted from war to consumer goods production. This consumer demand surge encouraged businesses to increase productivity, and by 1955, the United States, with only 6% of the world's population, was producing almost half the world's goods. As the economy expanded, incomes rose. Real income is the income measured by the amount of goods and services it will buy, adjusted for inflation. Average American families had twice as much in real income to spend in the 1950s than they had in the 1920s, and spend it they did. Not only were Americans spending more money than ever before, but they were also spending it in different places. In the past, most people bought their goods in stores lining the main street of town. By the mid-1950s, however, suburban shopping centers were luring customers from downtown shopping districts. Shopping centers offered customers easy parking and a wide array of shops to browse, often in air-conditioned comfort. In 1964, there were more than 7,600 shopping centers across the United States. Businesses used methods pioneered in the 1920s to encourage customers to spend, one of which was persuasive advertising. By 1955, businesses were allocating $8 billion annually for ad campaigns that encouraged consumption. Another method businesses employed was offering consumers simpler ways to buy now and pay later. Large stores issued charge cards to their patrons, allowing them to charge goods to an account rather than to pay in cash. By 1960, Sears Roebuck had more than 10 million accounts, one for every 5 American families. In 1958, American Express launched the first all-purpose credit card, which could be used at stores, hotels, restaurants, and gas stations. A third strategy to encourage consumption was planned obsolescence. Brooke Stevens, the industrial designer who popularized the term, defined it as a way to create the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary. Through planned obsolescence, businesses manufactured products intended to seem obsolete or out of date after a certain period of time. For example, by introducing new fashions every season, clothing companies made last season's garments, although still wearable, look dated. Automobile companies had a similar practice, changing the styling of their cars every year. The economy begins to shift from goods to services. When the 1950s began, the economy was dominated by industries producing goods, like steel, appliances, and cars. By the end of the decade, industries that provided services rather than manufacturing goods were amassing value. The biggest and best-known manufacturing company was automaker General Motors, which in 1955 became the first U.S. corporation to earn more than $1 billion a year. GM accomplished this feat by producing and selling as many cars as its competitors combined. Another factor in GM's success was improved relationships with workers. In 1948, GM signed a historic agreement with the United Auto Workers Union, guaranteeing that GM workers would receive regular wage increases according to a cost of living index. Cost of living index measures differences in the price of goods and services over time. If inflation increases prices and the index measures cost of living by how much prices rose. The agreement, which Fortune magazine called the Treaty of Detroit, awarded GM years of labor peace. As the economic boom continued, new service industries began to compete for consumers, including fast food service. In 1954, an ambitious man named Ray Kroc visited McDonald's famous hamburgers in San Bernardino and was amazed by what he saw. A long line of customers was already queuing an hour before lunch, waiting to be served. Kroc asked people in line what they liked about the restaurant, receiving praise that the restaurant was clean, fast, and cheap. In addition, the burgers tasted good and customers did not have to tip. Kroc convinced the McDonald's brothers to hire him as a franchising agent. A franchise is an agreement to operate a business that carries a company's name and sells its products. The year Kroc opened his franchise restaurant in Des Plaines, Illinois, which was as widely successful as the original McDonald's. The restaurant was especially attractive to families with young children who did not feel comfortable in more formal restaurants. Under Kroc's leadership, hundreds of McDonald's soon dotted the landscape, and by 1963 the fast food chain had sold more than 1 billion hamburgers. Another news service industry, the motel chain, was inspired by a summer road trip. In 1951, Kemmons Wilson, a home builder in Tennessee, embarked on a family road trip to Washington, D.C. Each night he struggled to find a decent place for his family to stay. At times, motels were independent mom-and-pop operations. Some were clean, while others were filthy. Some charged extra for children, but others did not. The only way to learn which was by visiting numerous motels. A frustrated Wilson finally turned to his wife and announced he was going into the motel business. She asked how many motels he planned to build, which he answered, "Oh, about 400. That ought to cover the country. His motels would be clean, affordable, easy to find, and family friendly. If I never do anything else worth remembering in my life," he added, "children are going to stay free at motels." After he returned home, Wilson built his first Holiday Inn. He later franchised his chain with a number of Holiday Inns grew rapidly. Other chains, including Best Western, Howard, Johnson's, had begun to expand, such that by the 1960s the motel chain had become a fixture along American highways. The workforce shifts from blue-collar to white-collar jobs. As the economy developed and changed, people's occupations also shifted. When the 1950s began, blue-collar workers, or people who work in factories or at skilled trades such as plumbing or auto repair, comprised the largest portion of the workforce. The name originates from the durable blue shirts that these laborers often wore to work. Most were paid hourly, but at the end of the 1950s, American workforce looked markedly different. For the first time in history, white-collar workers or professionals, including doctors, lawyers, engineers, salespeople, managers, and office staff, outnumbered blue-collar employees. Because white-collar employees worked in offices, they could wear white shirts to work without fear of getting them dirty. Most received a weekly or yearly salary rather than an hourly wage. Both groups prospered during the 1950s. As blue-collar workers moved into the middle class, they began to dress, act, and consume like their white-collar neighbors. During the war, observed sociologists in Detroit, you could sit on a streetcar and tell at a glance who were the blue-collar defense workers and who were the white collars. Today, you just can't tell who's who. During the 1950s, the number of people with white-collar jobs grew rapidly. At the end of the decade, white-collar workers outnumbered blue-collar Americans. White-collar workers were far less likely to join labor unions than their blue-collar counterparts. Marriage, family, and the baby boom. Marriage, family, and the baby boom. The year 1946 was 1 second old when a Philadelphia woman married to a Navy machinist gave birth to a baby girl. Seconds later, a Chicago woman and an Army trombone-playing husband welcomed their newborn son. For both sets of parents, these births might have been long-awaited joyful events, but for demographers studying human population growth, these births marked the beginning of the largest population boom in U.S. history. A marriage boom leads to a baby boom. Marriage and birth rates dropped during the Depression because economic woes caused people to postpone life-altering decisions. The future looked brighter after World War II. So in 1946 alone, there were almost 2.3 million marriages in the United States, more than 600,000 above the previous year. More people were marrying, and at a younger age than during the war years. The average marrying age in the 1950s was 20 for women and 22 for men. Many of these newlyweds immediately started families at the same time that older couples who had delayed having children also began families of their own. It seems to me, observed a visitor from Great Britain, that every other young housewife I see is pregnant. This resulted in a baby boom, or a large increase in the number of babies born in proportion to the size of the population. At the baby boom's peak in 1957, 4.3 million births were recorded. In 1964, the last year of the baby boom, 4 in 10 Americans were under the age of 20. Economists and business people were thrilled by the baby boom. Signs in the New York City subway cars informed riders that your future is great in a growing America. Every day, 11,000 babies are born in America. This means new businesses, new jobs, new opportunities. Babies overflowing maternity wards boosted diaper services and baby food bottler sales. Home sales also boomed as young families flocked to suburbs in search of living space. Factory workers over time filled new homes with furniture and appliances to put in a car in every garage. Schools were challenged to fit the millions of children reaching schooling age each year. During the 1950s, California opened new schools at a rate of 1 per week to make room for baby boomers. Older schools added temporary buildings because to house more classrooms, while some handled the flood by offering 2 shifts of classes, one in the morning and another in the afternoon. Despite these efforts, large classes seating 2 students to a desk were common during the decade. Family roles of working dads and stay-at-home moms. The majority of baby boomers grew up in so-called traditional families with working dads and stay-at-home moms. The importance of marriage and family was emphasized in marriage manuals of the day. Whether you're a man or a woman, the family is the unit to which the most genuinely belong, wrote Dr. Schindler in The Woman's Guide to Better Living, 52 Weeks a Year. Family is the center of your living. If it isn't, you've gone astray. You've gone far astray. The belief that mothers should not work outside the home unless necessitated by economic reasons was promoted by leading childcare expert Dr. Benjamin Spock. First published in 1946, Spock's Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care was the bestseller for many years. Spock advised mothers to devote themselves full-time to raising their children, arguing that any distraction from the task, like a job or hobby, could damage a young child. The mass media reinforced traditional family roles. Magazines, movies, and advertisements portrayal the idea of family depicted the husband as the breadwinner of the family, the wife as the homemaker. The homemaker's role was expanded to include a number of jobs, such as mom became a teacher, doctor, nurse, cook, advisor, decorator, housekeeper, manager, and chauffeur all in one. A new medium called television idealized this family on screen in Leave It to Beaver character. June Cleaver was a stay-at-home mom who wore high heels, pearls, while working in the kitchen. When asked what kind of a girl her son Wally should marry, she answered, "Oh, some sensible girl from a nice family who's a good cook and can keep a nice house and see that he's happy." Jim Anderson, the sensible dad from Father Knows Best, calmly solved his family's problems every evening when he got home from work. In one episode, he advised his tomboy daughter, Kathy, to act helpless around boys. "The worst thing you can do," he told her, "is to try to beat a man at his own game." These television shows taught children the roles they would be expected to play as adults. Children received this message in other ways as well, like visiting toy stores filled with dolls and tea sets for girls and toy guns for boys. Girls were given a miniature hope chest to encourage them to dream of getting married one day. Children's books like Happy Family, a little golden book popular at the time, reinforced traditional roles with sayings such as "the happiest time of day is when father comes home from work." The strong societal emphasis on marriage led many young women to forego a college education, so women's colleges enrollments dropped sharply. Although some women pursued careers after college, many others dropped out early to get married, or transitioned straight from graduation into marriage. One professor at Smith College complained of having to cancel a final class with female senior honor students because it conflicted with too many bridal showers. Section 4. Population shifts to suburbs and Sunbelt states. In 1951, Bill and Alfred Levitt won a government contract to build thousands of homes for war industry workers in Norfolk, Virginia. Everything went wrong at first. For one, skilled workers were in short supply, and their schedule was also too tight. Since it seemed as though the Levitts would miss their deadlines and lose money, they rethought their building process. They divided construction process into 27 steps, and then hired and trained 27 teams of workers, each specialized in one of the steps. By the project's end, the Levitts had revolutionized the process of building homes. Middle-class families moved to the suburbs. No industry suffered more from the Depression and wartime periods than the home-building industry. In these years, housing construction dropped from more than 1 million new homes a year to fewer than 100,000. At war's end, housing was in such short supply that 250 used trolley cars were sold at homes in Chicago. Returning veterans were eager to buy homes and start families, and the GI Bill were ready to help them acquire home loans at low interest rates, but there were few homes to buy. The Levitt brothers took advantage of the housing dearth, working to create places where veterans could use their home loans. In 1947, they broke ground on Levittown, the first planned housing community in the nation. Levittown was located on Long Island, about 20 miles from New York City, where the brothers built 17,447 homes by 1951. They would eventually build 2 more Levittowns before 1960 in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. To lower costs, Levitts built small, boxy, almost identical homes with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Work crews moved from house to complete their specialized jobs, including tile crews and floor crews. One team specialized in white paint, while another one apply only red paint. By mass-producing their homes, the Levitts accelerated production, building 36 houses a day in 1948. They were also able to keep prices of their homes under $8,000. The first Levittown in New York was a type of suburb called a bedroom community. Most people who lived there commuted by car or public transportation to jobs in New York City. Although the commute time could be tiring, countless young families were eager to live in a clean, safe, child-friendly suburb. Between 1950 and 1956, the number of Americans living in suburban communities increased by 46%. These new suburbanites were overwhelmingly white and middle class. Many suburbs, including Levittown, did not sell to African Americans. This racial and class homogeneity is part of the suburb's appeal for buyers. Everybody lives on the same side of the tracks, observed the Saturday Evening Post in 1954. They have no slums to fret about, no families of conspicuous wealth to envy, no traditional upper crust too wet and thwart their social aspirations. Whether the wagon Weather and wages spur migration to the Sun Belt. Not only were Americans moving from cities to suburbs, they were also migrating from the northern half of the country to the Sun Belt. This belt of warm weather states stretched across the southern third of the United States, reaching from Florida to California. After World War II, manufacturers and other businesses began relocating to the Sun Belt, attracted by low-cost labor. Plus, unions were less involved in the Sun Belt states than they were in older industrial regions of the North. The Sun Belt tourist industry also grew as families flocked to sunny beaches and new attractions like Disneyland. As business moved south, people followed California as equally affected by this migration. Between 1950 and 1960, California's population grew by 50%, from around 10.6 million to more than 15.7 million people. Other Sunbelt states experienced similar growth. Two technological advancements enabled this population shift. The first was the design and construction of the massive water projects in the arid Southwest, including building dams on major rivers to capture the water in giant reservoirs. This water was then distributed through a system of canals and aqueducts to fast-growing cities like Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Los Angeles, California. The second key technology was developing room air conditioning for home use, which made summers bearable in the Sunbelt states like Florida and Arizona. Yearly room air conditioners sales increased from 30,000 in 1946 to over 1 million in 1953. The triumph of the automobile. The triumph of the automobile. On September 4th, 1957, a new car appeared in a Ford showroom around the country. Consumers lined up in record numbers to view the latest Ford creation, the Edsel. Ford executives were thrilled until they realized that people were looking but not buying, since most people did not like what they saw. The Edsel was designed to be the biggest, flashiest, most luxurious Ford ever, but public response was less than enthusiastic. One member of the media called it an Oldsmobile sucking a lemon, recalled a rare Edsel owner. Another called it a Pontiac pushing a toilet seat. After 3 years of poor sales, Ford gave up on the Edsel. Such failures were rare in the 1950s, as automobile sales stayed strong throughout the decade, accounting for the growth of suburbs and increased demand for cars. The middle-class dream, 2 cars in every garage. Suburban life depended on automobile access. Because most suburbs lacked public transportation, fathers commuted by car to their jobs in nearby cities, while mothers drove to supermarkets and suburban shopping centers. After school, children relied on the family car to attend their music lessons or sports games. Suburban families found they needed not 1 but 2 cars in their garage. Cars were more than a necessity in the booming consumer culture, as they also became a status symbol or a sign of wealth and prestige. Automakers encouraged car owners to trade in last year's model for the newest one in order to keep up with their neighbors. Companies urged consumers to move up to ever more expensive cars to demonstrate their material success. The Edsel was introduced as the smart car for the young executive or professional family on the way up, and a 1958 ad proclaimed, "They'll know you've arrived when you drive up in an Edsel." An Oldsmobile ad from the same year enthused. Obviously, this is a car to attract attention. Its precedent-breaking beauty fully deserves all the applause owners are giving it. Men and women who have just recently moved up to a '58 Oldsmobile from another make are the loudest on their praise, proudest of their new possessions. Throughout most of the 1950s, car sales surpassed 7 million a year. By 1958, more than 67 million cars were on the road, and nearly 12 million families owned 2 or more cars. 2 years later, the census reported that 65% of working Americans drove cars to work. Roads to everywhere, the interstate highway system. As the majority of Americans began to depend on cars for transportation, they demanded improved roads. State and federal lawmakers responded by funding new highway construction programs. the most ambitious of which was authorized by Congress in 1956 to construct a nationwide interstate highway system. The system's goal was to connect major cities across the country by a network of superhighways. President Eisenhower strongly supported federal funding of the interstate highway system. He recalled the usefulness of the four-lane autobahns, or high-speed highways built by Germany in the 1930s to move troops through World War II. With the United States engaged in the Cold War, he viewed it as a system of superhighways as an important element of the nation's defense. Both troops and weapons could be transported easily and quickly in a network of high-speed highways. By 1960, about 10,000 miles of interstate highway had been constructed. The modern system had around 45,000 miles of highway built with equally high standards. Interstate highways are divided and have at least two lanes in either direction. Access is controlled by on-ramps and off-ramps, and the flow of traffic is not interrupted by traffic lights or railroad crossings. Curves are engineered to be safe at high speeds, while rest areas are interspersed for travelers' comfort. The interstate highway system benefited the country in many ways. It made travel by road over long distances both faster and safer, and created economic opportunities for roadside businesses such as gas stations, motels, and restaurants, which arose near interstate exits. By improving nationwide access to the highway system, gave people more choices of where to live, work, shop, and vacation. For better or worse, the highway system also furthered Americans' dependence on cars and trucks as their main form of transportation. How did automakers persuade Americans to buy a new car every year? For many Americans in the 1950s, buying a new car was a yearly ritual. Automakers encouraged this practice in two ways. First, each year they made changes to the style so that each year's models looked different from those of the year before. Second, they introduced new features every year designed to make driving more pleasurable. The combined effect was to make last year's car look and feel old long before its useful lifetime was over. 6. Technological advances transform everyday life. In 1953, Charles Mee was a 14-year-old high school football player in Barrington, Illinois. On the way to a dance one summer night, Mee fell ill. He was dizzy, unsteady on his feet, and chilled. Later that night, he could not stand, so his parents drove him to the nearest hospital. The head nurse took one look at Mee and pronounced the boy has polio. Mee knew that his life had changed forever. Advances in medicine extend life expectancy. Mee's case was not irregular. In fact, polio, or infantile paralysis, was one of the most feared diseases of the 20th century. The first polio epidemic in the United States in 1916 paralyzed 27,000 people and killed 9,000. Over the next 40 years, polio epidemics occurred nationwide every summer. The worst of these annual epidemics was 1952, when nearly 60,000 new polio cases were reported. Perhaps the most famous victim of polio was President Franklin Roosevelt, who established the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis to seek a cure for polio in 1938. Over the next 17 years, the foundation funded research to develop a vaccine to thwart polio, eventually leading to Jonas Salk's creation of the first polio vaccine. The vaccine was comprised of very small pieces of poliovirus so that the people with the vaccine developed antibodies to protect them from the actual poliovirus. In 1954, some 2 million school children participated in vaccination trials. Statistics show that the vaccine to be as much as 90% effective in preventing polio. The dreaded disease had finally been conquered. Surgical techniques also advanced rapidly in the 1950s, and the first open-heart surgery and kidney transplant were performed during the decade. The first pacemaker, a device designed to regulate the beating of a patient's heart, was developed. Medical researchers also began to experiment with heart transplants. A number of diseases once considered fatal were routinely cured in the 1950s through antibiotic drugs. Penicillin, streptomycin, and other wonder drugs attacked bacteria that caused everything from earaches to pneumonia and tuberculosis. These medical advances contributed to an increase in life expectancy during the 1950s. A child born in the 1950s could expect to live to age 68. In 1960, the life expectancy had reached 69 years. Peaceful use of nuclear energy. During the 1950s, scientists explored peaceful uses of nuclear energy. One of the most promising was generating electricity. It was not too much to expect our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter, predicted Lewis Strauss, chair of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission in 1954. 3 years later, the first full-scale nuclear power plant opened in Shippingport, Pennsylvania. Medical researchers also discovered new uses for nuclear energy in the 1950s. Radioactive isotopes were utilized in the diagnosis and treatment of disease, and using X-rays as a diagnostic tool became common practice. Meanwhile, specialists in nuclear medicine began using radioactive iodine to treat thyroid cancer. Computers enter the workplace. In 1946, the two engineers at the University of Pennsylvania built one of the earliest electronic digital computers, called ENIAC, Electronic Numerical Integrator Computer. It contained nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes and took up approximately 1,500 square feet of floor space, almost as much as two Levittown homes. The ENIAC could perform 300 multiplications per second. 5 years later, the same team introduced the first commercially successful computer, the UNIVAC. The computer was capable of more than crunching numbers. It could manage letters and words as well. A UNIVAC proved its power in 1952, accurately predicting the election of Eisenhower just 45 minutes after polls closed. The invention of the transistor, a small, low-powered electronic device, in 1947 fostered dramatic improvements in computer design. By 1959, transistors had replaced bulky and unreliable vacuum tubes. As computers shrank in size, they appeared in more workplaces. These new machines revolutionized data collection and storage and accelerated the work of record keepers, such as librarians and tax collectors. But at the decade's end, few people could foresee a time when there would be a personal computer in almost every desk. The years following World War II were a time of prosperity in the United States. As the economy boomed, fears of a return to depression